In our project, we will be talking about pieces of evidence for a revolving Earth. Believe it or not, this was actually debated about 3 centuries ago, so let's jump in. Before we get started, let's go through a quick vocabulary review to help understand our topic. Revolution, or revolving, is where one object moves around the other. Examples is that the moon is to be considered revolving around the Earth. And as we get into our project, you will find that in a heliocentric model, all planets revolve around the sun. Before we get into the evidence, let's get into the history part first. The first ideas to where Earth lied in the universe came up from the famous Greek philosopher Aristotle. He theorized that the Earth was the center of everything and that the Sun, with other planets, revolved around it. This became known as the geocentric model. To help remember it, the root of geocentric is geo, like geography, which represents Earth. Here is a lineup of orbits in the geocentric model. Aristotle stated that since the Earth was the center, Venus would orbit closest to the Earth, then Mercury would come second, then the Sun, and so on. To make it easier to understand, here is a model of the geocentric model and what it would have looked like. The model only shows the inferior planets, which are the planets closer to the Sun than us. Even though it was thought up before, centuries later an astronomer named Galileo contrasted Aristotle's model. He came up with a theory that the Sun was the center and that all planets revolved around it. This was known as a heliocentric model. The root helio was the name of a sun god, if that helps remember. Here is a lineup of the heliocentric model. Very similar to the geocentric, but obviously the differences lie in the center. This is the model we obviously use today. The Sun being the center is more simple, which usually the most simple is the right answer. This is parsimony, which we'll briefly mention later. Let's move on to the evidence that supports why the Earth revolves around the Sun. The first piece of evidence that we'll talk about is the phases found on inferior planets such as Venus and Mercury. Before that, to break down what phases are simply half of the object that we see and the half that is lit up, if that makes sense. Further on, Venus and Mercury have similar phases to the Moon. Galileo first noticed these phases even when they passed in front of the Sun. What he couldn't see was these planets in an exact full stage, and sometimes they would disappear in the night sky. This led Galileo to believe that this was due to Venus and Mercury being behind the Sun. This cannot happen on geocentric model. Just take a look at this model. Nowhere in the planet's revolution do they go behind the Sun. This further explains that the geocentric model would not work because of this evidence piece found by Galileo himself. Now take a look at this slide. At this position on Earth, we would see a full phase from Venus. Galileo never observed this phase, furthering the evidence against the geocentric model. Furthering this piece of evidence, the heliocentric model shows that at times the planets go behind the Sun, and never can we see a direct full phase from them. Our final piece of evidence has to do with the reason for seasons. Yes, seasons are evidence for a revolving Earth, but are more complicated to explain. The reasons for seasons is due to the Earth tilted 23.5 degrees on its axis of revolution. The most important part for this to be evidence is because the Earth's tilt does not change. So if the Earth's tilt does not change, the Earth needs to revolve around the Sun yearly so we can experience different seasons. Some can argue that the geocentric model, to where a sun revolving around the Earth, can be the reasons for seasons. Well, if you look at the idea of parsimony, there are various other pieces of evidence that the Earth revolves. You can look at retrograde motion, Jupiter's moons, Venus's phases, etc. Since it's more simple, the reasons for seasons has to do with a revolving Earth. So that was our project. I hope it was found helpful. So here's a quick review and questions I'm going to ask you. Number 1, what is the differences between a geo and heliocentric model? Number 2, how are the phases of Venus evidence for a revolving Earth? And number 3, what are the reasons for seasons and why is it evidence for a revolving Earth?